Hello, everyone. Welcome to our second class of articulation, function, and fashion. It's a beautiful fall day here in Iowa City. We're still enjoying the nice weather and nice temperatures. So I hope it's a lovely day wherever you are and who might be joining us later on watching this as well. So last time we met, we talked a lot about the function of articulation. We talked a lot about the general approach of efficiency, sustainability, and effectiveness of the function of articulation in terms especially of how articulation relates to speech, in terms of consonants and vowels and placement and motion of the tongue. We talked about some of the misleading terminology that we might come across in our pedagogy, and how this sometimes leads us to maybe approach things in not the most natural or efficient way. Well, this week we are going to, or this month I should say, we are going to talk about practice solutions, basically how to keep ourselves accountable and to keep us on that path of efficiency, sustainability, and effectiveness. So when it comes to articulation, I think one really important thing to remember when we're practicing is that although a note might be disconnected technically, that doesn't mean that it should be disconnected musically speaking. And that can often be the challenge, both in function and in fashion, stylistically, in articulation. So that's something always really important to keep in mind. Phrasing should always guide any kind of articulated passage, just as it would in a lyrical one. And the absence of a slur also does not in itself indicate that a passage might not be lyrical. So things are not, mutually exclusive. Also, slurs do not necessarily indicate a lack of action. Sometimes when we have a slur, we have the feeling like we don't have to do anything, but we still have to effectively create a connection and a strong sense of legato, even in a slur. So just because we're not tonguing, sometimes we think we can just kind of chill out, so to speak. And musically, it can often be not as clear. And also technically, it can be not as clear if we're not purposefully and mindfully creating this slur or legato, just as we would if we were using the tongue. One thing that we have to, we've talked about a lot about, how it works. Once you understand how it works, then you have to really go into your basic training process so that you can keep it functioning, right? So I often find that one of the issues with articulations is sometimes we might start a passage out, and if it starts with the consonant T, and then the subsequent ones get weaker and weaker, just because we effectively get a little bit lazy, right? So just simply repeating a note and really training the tongue to continue the same action as it did the first time. So it doesn't get softer. So we have the volume of the tone, and then we also have basically the volume of the articulation. So immediately the second one got softer, just because I sort of naturally backed off, because I did it once and then I sort of checked it off the list, like, oh, I did it, I'm articulating, so I can stop now. So that's something that we want to be really clear of, just if we're practicing our basic single tonguing, whether it's just quarter notes, half notes. We might start with whole notes to give ourselves time to listen to the sound, go to half notes. to see if we can keep that articulation the same strength and keep the note the same volume. That's something very basic. You don't need a book for, you don't need any other, like, you know, fancy tools. You just need yourself and your instrument. And that's one thing I will say in general about methods, method books. There's no bad book, you know, there's no book that's better than another one. There might be some that are more comprehensive or have more or less material, but they're all essentially tools. Once I was teaching a lesson and I was really trying to, someone specifically wanted a lesson with me on articulation. And I was really trying to explain to them the how of it. And they were kind of insisting, no, I just want a regimen of what I should do. Which book should I use? And that and that. And I said, well, you can use whatever book you want, but if you don't have an effective approach, the book's not going to necessarily help you. So that's just always a word of caution about methods. They're all great, use them all, but they're ultimately a tool. And we're going to get to that later on when we talk about some articulation patterns in that. So this is a basic exercise you don't even need to have a book for. So something that you might want to always practice is like, can you keep that same consistent like clarity of the tonguing? Now, I am always going to, whether a passage is lyrical or not, I'm always going to approach it very, very lyrically. So I'm just going to share my screen real fast here if I can see if I can do this real quick. Okay. So I think you see on the screen a Telemann Sonata in F major. Is that correct? Everybody see that? Okay. So I just grabbed this because it starts with 4 articulated notes, and you know, if you heard a younger student playing this, you might hear like something like that, because often younger students play this piece, and it might sound like 4 individually disconnected notes. Anyway, this is a passage or something that I would definitely, you know, first play. You know, you can play it slurred. Obviously, there's 2 Fs in the middle, so you can't really slur those. They would have to be tied. So in this case, I'm going to play it essentially slurred, but still with an articulation. So I want to make sure that all the notes are long as possible, just as we talked about in the last class, that the vowel on the note, if I say tot, it's going completely into the next note. So just because I am playing very connectedly, musically speaking and sound-wise, doesn't mean that I can't use a clear T, okay? So I'm going to use a pretty pointed T, but I'm still going to connect with the airstream and with the sound quality. And I'm going to see how strong I can make that. Then I might want to back off and see, okay, how dull can I make it? That would be using the tongue more like a D, maybe even D in the style of an L, if I wanted it to be like more muted, right? Now I'm going to go back to something with a very clear pointed T. Now I have to consider the style, and that we're going to talk more about that fashion aspect in the next class, but this is an F major. It's pretty bright and feeling, right? So I might want something a little bit more crisp, but that doesn't mean that I want it to be kind of very dry, you know, that doesn't really have any sound quality in it in itself. So I definitely just don't want it to sound like tut, 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 tut. If we're saying tut, like King Tut, we're probably making it very, very, very dry. And in this case, I don't want to have that quality. You know, I would get that eventually if I would get faster. And that's not going to project very well in a hall, and it's just musically not going to flow very well, right? So essentially what I'm doing is, as I try to really go to the next note, it's almost like I'm making a little crescendo of sound, not really in volume, but just in the sustain of the note, in the vowel sound. Ta, ta. It's very, very subtle. You obviously don't want to go beyond that, like ta, ta, where you're getting kind of a wave of sound, and then it kind of chunks up the phrase either. So, but you can definitely practice that connectivity. Okay. Now, the other thing I would definitely practice is what I call a ha articulation, or some people call this like a tongueless attack. I've heard the phrase a diaphragm attack before. I don't like to use that because it's, as we know, the diaphragm is an involuntary muscle. And I think sometimes people confuse the diaphragm and the abdominal muscles, and if they're trying to make a kind of a big thrust or something in the abdominal muscles, first of all, that's not very efficient, and you can't sustain it over a long period of time, and it would be very laborsome. And it would make a lot of kind of commotion maybe that you don't necessarily want in the sound. So I'm just thinking of saying ha in a more sustained way. So I'm just going to start the sound without a tongue, just like I would say ta. It's like if you said ah. But what I'm really looking for is more of a consistent support. Now, our abdominal muscles are engaged in just about everything that we do. So there has to be a certain firmness to hold the shape of the sound, is what I essentially want of this vowel. And I'm going to think of leaning into the sustain, ha, ha, like this, rather than like a punch, ha, 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 where it kind of you hit and release. So ah, ah. It's kind of like if you sang ah. Now we're just going to cut off a short piece of it. Ah, ah. So it still rings and resonates. Okay, so I'm going to play the same thing. Aha, what happened? I cracked. This is a very good thing to check. So why did I crack? Well, I started in the upper register and then I went to the middle register. And the middle register is kind of like the crack zone, right around E, F natural, right? So when I do these ha's only, I can kind of really find the target of my embouchure to make sure that I'm thinking in the right place. So I have to decide. I kind of first ask myself, do I want to think of the F as being in the high register, or do I want to think of it as being in the low register? I think if the middle is bad, I just skip it all together. And I either think of a note being in the low or the high register to kind of make it not crack. So that's without the tongue. And what I'm trying to do as I do that is also not move my aperture, not move my embouchure. Because if I do also reset every time, that's going to take away from my accuracy, especially if I add the tongue. So I'm trying to keep it really centered and focused at the aperture. And that's if I add the tongue, okay? So first I make sure that I really find the target. Also, I want this ha, ha to feel like it's bouncing. So I don't want my notes to kind of fall down in pitch. That's super important. Now, reasons notes fall down in pitch is a couple of things. They lose their shape. Well, how do they lose their shape? They either lose their shape by you loosening the formation of the aperture, letting go of that, or by not supporting the pitch of the sound in your body. Just as if you would sing, ah, and you let go of the support apparatus, ah. So, ah. So when you end the note, you have to really think of ending, ah, with the shape of the sound, not letting it change. So again, as we do it with the flute, that's without the tongue. This is with the tongue. Okay, now I'm still kind of on the longer side. If I wanted to make it a little shorter, again, it's like I'm going to think I have a piece of paper and I'm just going to snip off a piece. I'm not going to change anything about the process of how I produce the sound. I'm not going to change anything about the process of how I start the note. I'm just going to shorten up the other side. So that's without the tongue. This is with the tongue. Pardon me. Then I'd get something like that. So that's maybe how I might go about really making sure that in a quality of sound way that my articulation is even sounding. So most of it had very little to do with the tongue. It was more from the sound quality and the release of the note. Then, of course, as I talked about prior, we have to make sure that we're keeping the training of the consonant going in a very clear and strong way. So that's how I would approach achieving quality of the evenness of the articulation. Now, when we talk about style, we might not want evenness in terms of how things come across. We might want different notes to have different inflections, and that's going to be a conversation for another time. But just in terms of starting with the quality, even if I ultimately want to shade the sound a little differently, I'm going to start with something a little bit more homogeneous. And the reason for that is that if you're a sculptor or a wood carver or something like that, you want to start with a piece of material that's basic and large enough that you have something to work with, right? You don't want to start with like shaved off pieces because that's going to be limiting in terms of what you can do. So I think first, before I find like a style, because sometimes when we're working on style, it might come across as a lack of really focusing on the quality of the sound if we're not careful. So it's really important that we're considering both. First, I'm going to go for a kind of a generic quality so that every note is equally audible, because ultimately we need to have a clear projection. And that's not about playing louder, it's that our ideas are very clear, and that's again in the articulation and enunciation, that they stay very clear. Then once I get that generic quality, I'll ask myself, how can I shade this slightly so that every note doesn't sound homogeneous in style, because stylistically that's not necessarily what I may want. But that's how I would go about doing something like that. Okay. We talked about, let me see if I can put this in the chat. I have a handout. Let me see if it posts. I sent it in the chat, and I'll try to open it up, and I'll try to share the screen as well so you can see this. haven't shared the file this way, so I'm not sure if it worked. I can also try to send it as a PDF. Hang on one second. Sorry, I'm trying to toggle many screens to share with you, so I just want to be sure. Just bear with me for 1 second. It's sort of a double tonguing practice sheet that I have. And I'm going to try it this way, at least so you can see it. Okay, my screen. Okay, I don't know, was anybody able to open up the link that I sent? You were, okay. So as you can see on, in either in the link that I sent or on the screen, this is sort of a double tonguing training or practice sheet that I created it when I was a student and I've used it. It's very basic, and I use it with my students. We talked about last time that in any case, when you're practicing double tonguing, not to just focus on the consonant, but it's really important to make sure in any case that both consonants have equal strength and pressure and speed on the release, and that the following vowel matches as well. Even if you wanted a difference in terms of stylistic reasons, the space that the vowel occupies really has to take up the same amount of space rhythmically speaking. And of course, all of our finger movements and coordination is very important. So if we're practicing double tonguing, it's usually because we need speed, right? Sometimes, people say, oh, it's not the speed that counts. Well, when you're playing Shostakovich's 10th Symphony and the tempo marking is 176, you can't really tell the conductor, oh, maestro, that's not the speed that counts, right? Like, you got to make it happen. That's part of our job as flute players sometimes, is we got to be able to play fast and articulate quickly, or Scheherazade or something like that might require that of us. So when I'm playing something faster, I like to not focus on the movement, but actually how much time I'm on the note, which might be very little, but it's really important to focus on being on the note, not only moving. Sometimes if we focus on like constant motion, it's almost like we're in a permanent somersault and we never land. So we need to think of, when we move our finger rings, not fingers, but finger rings, we change positions, we have to think about how we land and then how we get to another one. You can think of if it's like a monkey swinging from the trees or something. It's got to really grab, and it's got to land on the tree and grab that position before it can swing to the next, no matter how fast it's moving. If it doesn't really land or grab the tree, then it can't keep swinging and it's not going to stay, up. So again, I'm thinking about how much time I'm on the note, not just moving. Now, the duration of my stay is going to shorten up as I get faster, but I think when we think about constant movement or speed, we panic, and then that's when things get a little uncoordinated. So on the sheet, you have various combinations of, I wrote it out as it's just a consonant, but I would say dugga dugga or something like that. So you can use it on any scale of your choice, all scales. And first I wrote out a traditional double tonguing, dugga dugga dugga. And then as a dotted rhythm, and then as a reverse dotted rhythm. Then number 4 would be reversed double tonguing, and in the straight sense, and then reversed on a dotted and then a reverse dotted. So gada, 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 or kata, 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 right? And then starting number 7, it would be only the g or the k sound. Now, probably I should have wrote it out so that only the g sound came as the second sequence and then the reverse came as the last. But in any way, you can practice it that way also. It doesn't really matter which sequence you practice it. In fact, some days you might want to start with just the G. I think, we talked about this last time. One of the reasons why the t sound sometimes gets a little dominant is, first of all, we always start with that in our practice. We usually have done it for years before we even introduce the G. There are more T's in the Scrabble bag than there are K's or G's, right? It's a more used sound. So just in terms of training, it's good to sometimes also start with the ka or the g syllable, depending on what you're going for, right? So if I were just to play, let's say, G major scale, it's written on G, but you can play it on any scale, as I said. I'll do. Of course, you can slur it first to really listen for the sound. Focus on the connections of the fingerings, right, and how you're on the notes, and then swiftly moving to the next. When I introduce that daga or ta-ka, I want to make sure. We talked a little bit about taco last time, saying the word taco, right? That you don't say taco, you don't interrupt it with a glottal stop. So what we don't want is where you're saying ta-ka, and cutting off the vowel. So just as I was working on that telemon, I really want to make sure that I have a continuation of sound and that the vowel sound continues. And I could, if I wanted to get faster, I could do it at any speed, right? And then I'm going to do the reverse, dotted rhythm. Now, especially on the dotted, I want to ta-ka-ta. I really want to kind of kick out the the ka syllable. Pardon me, almost putting an accent on the 16th note in that case would be a ka, just to be sure that it's very, very, very pronounced, right? Then I'm going to do the reverse. And see how quickly I can get that, right? Okay, that would be that. And then this would be all K or all G. That's about as fast as I can get that with just K without it getting too or really clacky or closing off the sound. But I want to see how swiftly I can get that moving, okay? So then I would do the same process on all ga or ka. And then again, I might go back to the normal way of doing it, and then it's probably going to feel a little bit easier. Now in the second column, starting at number 10, it's the same process as the first column, except you're going to do a double note. So on each pitch, you'll do double notes. So it would be that would be 12, then 13 would be the and so on and so forth. Okay, so you get the idea. So Again, this is just like a training sheet. Of course, you could do it on any scale, A major, you know, whatever scale you're doing, that was all ka, 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 ka. And if I don't have a strong, clear vowel and sound airstream moving through, I'm going to get almost no sound. It's just going to sound like kind of like a choking sound plus air, which I don't think is high up there on the list for beautiful things that we want to listen to, right? So that's probably not going to be the most effective. So it's really important as we're doing these things, you know, that we're not just practicing from here forward, but we're really practicing from back here, which I mean, include these two wonderful things on your head, and that you're always listening very, very, very intentfully for the resulting sound. Sometimes we're focusing on doing something, or we're trying to follow some instruction from a teacher or a book or something, and we forget to listen. Our ears are our best guide, and we really want to make sure that the best sound quality is always resulting. So again, here's, you can grab that sheet from that, I think from that link that I sent, and it can be a good practicing guide for you. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing my screen here. Just want to go, yes, I just want to make sure there's no questions in the chat. Okay. Okay. Yeah, I just want to make sure I see your question, Amy, about the vowels, the taco example. Do I change the vowel? Well, I wouldn't say like taco, something like that. That's just the word is just to see that you don't cut the vowel to say the next consonant. But in different registers, we talked a little bit about this last time as well. For example, in the low register, you don't want to have too much pressure in the sound because that's not the low register, right? So we need a little bit more volume, just as when you speak, right? You can't have too high pressure, you can't get a low pitch. So so if I'm double tonguing in the low register, I might have a vowel shape like aw, like in dog, you know, so it's a little bit more open. Something like that. If I used a vowel like E, it almost doesn't want to let me be in that register. So I might reserve for E, like a tiki, 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 something like that in the high register. If I wanted something kind of brighter like that, you know, this would be a little bit more open. A little bit more ringing if I wanted it to be softer and really bright. Something like that. That is where I might use a tiki, 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 tiki. Keeps things a little higher, a little thinner, adds a little bit more pressure to the sound. So yes, I will change the vowel depending on the circumstance, but not really like in a sequence so much. Like what you might sometimes change, for example, like something in the Mendelssohn Scherzo, you might change even like the consonants, like we start in the low register. I might be a little bit more, because I want it to have enough volume in the sound in the low register. I might start off with more of a dugga 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 tugga tugga tugga, and at the top where I want it to be a little lighter, it's supposed to be, you know, fairies, you know, dancing kind of feeling. I might go to something like a little tugga tugga or tiki tiki at the top. So in a passage, I might. So I was dugga dugga tugga ta. I did that. So I might change things up like that to give a little shape and style. Again, we'll talk more about that in the next one. So that's how I might help to give shape and style to the passage. If I just kept it completely the same, now that's where we were talking about quality before. I might do that to make sure I'm really achieving that consistent quality. but style wise, in terms of feeling this kind of bouncy 3/8 meter and reflecting this Midsummer's Night's Dreams character, that doesn't sound so evocative, let's say. You know, I'm not giving a lot of, so that still has the same quality of sound, but I'm changing up the character. That's maybe a little bit more advanced, but if you're looking for that kind of, you know, advanced stylistic approach, you know, especially like in an orchestra audition, there are so many what I would call like B plus, A minus level players, which means really good. That's not a bad grade. We come to think of it as like a bad grade, but that means like people are really, really, really good. And there's like a crowd of those kind of level players, really, really good players. Now, to get from A minus to A or A plus, it can't just be like consistent and kind of generic quality. It has to have that consistency of generic quality that everyone can appreciate, but it also has to have something a little bit extra and a little bit special. And understanding those, you know, nuances of what's possible is really important, I think, to set yourself apart. So in all cases, we want to pay attention, again, listen carefully, pay careful attention to another thing, when you're not playing the flute, pay attention to how you use your tongue. So for example, if you have, some people have different kind of, I don't like to use the word impediment, but that's what it's sometimes called, like a speech impediment or speech characteristics of, like, in terms of S's, you know, that's gonna come across in your flute playing too, probably. So that's something that we want to kind of take stock of when we're not playing, to think about, oh yeah, why do I sound that way when I talk? You know, like what's actually happening with my tongue. So that's a good thing to do to help to, you know, find some of these subtle differences when you're practicing. Okay, I think most of us probably have used Tefnel and Gobert's 17 daily exercises at some point or another. It's sort of considered like, you know, the Flute Bible or something like that, although there are other wonderful books as well. But, you know, that's a very common book used in flute pedagogy. So let me just grab my screen share one more time. We have a couple people. Okay. Well, that's not the screen I wanted to share. Okay. Are we seeing Tefnel and Gobert? Yeah, okay, just making sure, because my screen is showing two different things. So thank you. Okay. So now at the top.
I think we go, that's probably up there.
Okay. At the top of the Tefnel and Gobert, this is EJ1. So we have articulate. So it says, you know, you should practice these 10 articulations. Well, they're actually not articulations, they're patterns, right? They're articulation patterns. And what we always have to be careful of when we're practicing, sometimes when we practice, again, we're looking for that consistency, and we're going so much for that consistency that if we're not careful, we're actually practicing to limit ourselves. So if we see two slurred and two tongued, and there's one way in our mind that two slurred and two tongued should sound in terms of being good, then we're actually practicing to limit ourselves to sound like that no matter the style of music, right? We talked a little about it in the last class. For example, that's a common articulation in Mozart or Beethoven classical style. I don't want my Mozart and my Beethoven to sound exactly the same. There are subtle differences to me. Mozart is a little bit more effervescent. Beethoven for me is sometimes a little bit more robust, you know? So these patterns are starting points. Sometimes people say, oh, I have to find a way to make my practice sing fun. And I always kind of think like, Well, if you have to find ways to make it interesting or fun, then you're probably not interested in what you're doing. Because if you're really interested in what you're doing, then you have a curiosity beyond just what you see, right? And most people are just trying to be good citizens of the flute world and doing what the book says and following the example and everything, and that's great. But we want to use it as a starting point, as a place to build our curiosity and to discover new things. So let's take that very common two slurred, two articulated, or two tongued pattern, right? So okay, so that's it. So we have a lot of possibilities of what can happen. So first, we have to think about, well, what kind of sound do I want? What kind of dynamic do I want? I think most people, if they're really honest, tend to practice their daily exercises. I don't like to call them warm-ups, because warm-ups for me get you ready to play that day. Daily exercises get you ready to play for every day. So when you're practicing your daily exercises, if you're honest, I think most people will practice them in the mezzo zone, whether that be mezzo piano or mezzo forte. You know, we just kind of practice in that nice, comfortable zone. And we tend to, sometimes flute players, since we're always trying to get a big sound, you know, we might go to the forte, but oftentimes we don't even practice this stuff piano. And that's where I think a lot of flute players show their weaknesses in their softer playing, right? So having control of this at all dynamics is really important. So first of all, I'm going to think about what sound I want to have. So let's just say we're going to go for like a kind of basic mezzo forte right now, round sound, okay? I might just kind of hold the first note without tongue and make sure that I'm just really connected to the instrument and my sound is focused, right? And then we have to think, okay, the tempo. Now I think I'm gonna start with a pretty clear consonant. So I'm gonna start with a T, and I wanna use ta-ka. But okay, so what's gonna happen with the next note? So the next note is slurred, right? Again, sometimes because we're not doing an action, we don't articulate, it's easy to rush also, and we get that kind of uneven rhythm, right? So we have to think of that the consonant is not the sound, it's the start of the sound, because sometimes when we tongue or articulate, we play the note, we hear the tonguing, and we immediately move on to the next note. So we got to make sure that that vowel sound is sustained. And now the second note should be the same duration, right? Then we have to ultimately decide how stylistically we want to exit it. Do we want it to sustain directly into the next consonant? So that would be where it's completely long and the same length as the first. Do we want it to be slightly shorter than the first? Do we want it to be very clipped? Okay, then how do we want the third and fourth notes to be? Do we want them to be shorter? Do we want them to be longer? What kind of consonant do we want? What kind of vowel do we want? There's so many different possibilities, you know. So of course, it can seem like you're like, oh my God, there's so many things to think about. This can be so overwhelming. Well, yes, it can be if you think you have to do it all every day or something like that. And you don't, you just have to be conscious that these possibilities exist and that you're incorporating them into your daily routine. So you might say, okay, I'm going to play in A major or, you know, F sharp minor or whatever, and think about what are the characteristics of that key. Now we're getting into the fashion part, the style part, and how might I change some of these, you know, characteristics to get some of these subtle differences, right? So For example, in A major, the C sharp is the third of the chord. So even though it's a very bright key, and I might want my articulation to sound bright, the third of the chord needs to sit low pitch-wise. If I'm not careful, C sharp on the flute is already sharp. If I play something like that, then that C sharp sticks out like a sore thumb, right? So I have to think in A major, I really want a very kind of long open vowel on that note. So I might get something like that. If it's too bright, then that C sharp is going to be sharp, right? So conversely, if I'm playing in a minor key, let's say, I might want it to be a little darker, right? So I might use a dugga dugga or something like that and keep the vowel also, you know, pretty long. Again, maybe I'm in the upper register. This is like a Beethoven serenade. Anyway, I might want it to be very bright and crisp in the upper register. So I might, you know, use that characteristic of that key in that. So we can change it up. So I just use that two slurred, two tongued in that case, because that's like a very common pattern that we come across in all types of music, especially classical style. Of course, there are many other types of articulation. There's two tongued and two slurred, which in some ways, I often hear that, you know, when someone is practicing that, it's a little bit more tricky. So what I try to do is when I am articulating, when I'm using the tongue, separating notes, I try to hear a slur. And when I'm slurring, I try to hear an articulation. So I try to hear the opposite of what I'm doing, you know, so that I'm not kind of falling into those traps. So and then it's even that way. So again, I'm going to try to hear a slur. So I hear both notes connected and even when I'm articulating, and I'm going to try to hear an articulation when I'm slurring because I don't want my slur to sound mushy. So I think that's really important. And then you have a couple other articulation like that one is particularly tricky to not sound dotted because it'll sound dotted if you clip the notes dot da 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 da. If you say that so da 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 da. It's actually really necessary to be very lyrical throughout. You know, so again, these articulations are a starting point, and there's so many different ways that we can practice that. Even, you know, we can take we can add some more things. Like you might want to do like what we were doing in our double taking sheet. You might want to double the notes. You know, you can do four notes. You know, you could do like many different things. You know, you can make your own patterns. So that's always just a cautionary thing that I give to everybody is the easiest way to kind of burn out and get bored is just kind of follow the directions of the book and just do the same thing every day. Because that's just no fun for anybody, right? Because it just feels like you're trying to meet someone else's expectations and you're not really on your own journey with that. So once again, books are wonderful and we should use all of them, but we don't want to just kind of fall into that trap. Now we are gonna, that's most of what I wanted to talk about today. In the next class, we are gonna talk about more stylistic things, and I could continue talking about that even like with this. And we talked about it a little bit, obviously, of finding these subtle differences. So if you do have questions, which I love, you can go ahead and put them in the chat box, and then I can answer them for you. I'm gonna stop sharing my screen. Or if you prefer to just shout out your question, that's also fine. Oh, Brian, sorry, I didn't see you. The name of the book is it's the 17 Daily Exercises of Tefenel and Gobert, which you can find easily on IMSLP. Do I ever anchor your tongue against the top teeth or no? I don't believe in anchor tonguing because we don't do this when we speak. So if I said not some speak, you wouldn't understand the thing I said. It would sound like this. So this was a bit anchor tonguing. So that's not going to work when I talk. It's not going to work when I play the flute. So I'm not going to anchor it anywhere because that's just not efficient and it's not effective. Same thing with the lower lip. You see a lot of flute players that will often anchor the tongue here. If I do that, you don't understand what I say because I can't get any vowel shape. Now it sounds like I'm making fun of someone and I'm not. It's just, that's what it will sound like if you do that. So again, you can practice anything and make it work for you, but in terms of that efficiency or ability to be flexible, you might get it to work in one circumstance and it might be great and your basic sound might work for you and all that, but that's the only thing that you can do. So that's for me. Again, I'm not going to do anything with the flute that I don't do when I'm not playing the flute. So I want to make sure that that's, staying consistent. In terms of staccato with vowel sounds, to answer Peter's question, again, essentially I'm focusing on like the sound quality. So I'm always going to think like I have a left side of the note, the center, and the right side of the note, essentially. So it's like the left side of the note and the center never change. It's just that the right side of the note gets closer to the left side of the note, and I still have the center. So I'm going to play like. Something like that. Okay, does that answer your question? So again, the vowel, the consonant doesn't change at the beginning. The vowel doesn't really change. It's just I'm shortening up that space.
Right. It was more, looking at how you were attaching or attacking the vowel sound, especially higher, versus lower. And I know that makes a change. Sorry, I just jumped in. But...
No problem. Sometimes it's easier to do that. No problem. Yeah. Question about involving the throat. Yeah. I think this goes back to, I talked about a little bit last time, because we call the beginning of the note, this terminology, we often refer to it as an attack. When we think, we're trying to do something unnatural. Like when we release a consonant, we are essentially doing that, releasing the pressure from the tongue away from the striking point. Ta, which basically opens the door for the vowel to move forward. So if you're thinking that the tongue goes ta, it's like you're ta 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 ta. It's like you're choking yourself, because when you put your tongue forward too much, ta, it closes the back of the throat. And that's something that flute players love to say, open your throat, open your throat. Well, your throat is open, because if it wasn't, you would not be living. So your throat is open, but something can close the throat, and that is the tongue. And the way, if we're thinking of doing something in kind of that, unnatural way, like attacking, then it's going to cause some tension in the throat, because something has to, has to feel like it's getting some stability. And that's why I think people tend to get throat noises, is because they're thinking that it's the consonant that is going forward in that sense. It's actually the vowel that's going forward, and the consonant is going back if you're talking about a T. So talk, and that release of the T kind of opens the door for the sound, in this case the vowel, to move forward. So while I cannot say in your Mary, in your specific case exactly what's going on, because it's really hard to just make assessments without hearing someone, that is something that is often generally the case. Also, the fact that the flute is in front of us and we feel like we have, and the people that listen to us are in front of us, everything is in front of us, we tend to kind of push things forward, and we actually have to feel that we are actually keeping the sound in order to project the sound. It's kind of like if I wanted to make you feel that I was a very rich person, you'd have to see me with all my bags of money. If I just gave them all to you, I wouldn't be rich anymore. So that's a kind of a weird thing about perception in terms of projecting. But we have this notion that everything has to go forward, and it does in a way, but we have to actually focus on how it resonates this way so that it can go forward. So that's a general thing that I think that happens that does create that throat issue. Any other last minute questions? Good. Well, once again, once you really understand how it works in the most simple, basic way possible, that's half the battle. Then comes the training aspect. That's just how you do anything. It's that muscle memory of, but the two things have to go hand in hand. There has to be a clear and deep understanding of what you're doing. Then the muscle memory has to kick in so that, you remember how to do it, you keep doing it. But if it's just muscle memory and you don't practice it, if you don't have that understanding and you don't practice it as much, then your muscle memory will go. So it is both things. I think we want to practice always first to understand rather than to do. And once we really understand, it's a lot easier to do. So that's something I think is really important in terms of articulation. And again, that we're always listening first for creating a beautiful sound, or a sound quality that is one that is clear and projecting. Sometimes we don't want it to be like beautiful in that sense. It might be, a harsher sound for the style. And we're going to get more into that next time. I will say in advance of that talk, I think articulation is one of the most underused tools for expression. And flute players don't tap into it because they're doing what I talked about, which is practicing to limit themselves because they're just trying to achieve that kind of basic quality and consistency that we all want, in terms of that quality. But then we don't use those amazing tools that are possible in terms of the expressivity of the music. And it's really, really important. We talk a lot about vibrato, we talk about tone colors. Well, the articulation and the kind of inflections that you can get from that are really important in creating your artistic product as well. Okay, well, thank you so much, everyone, for joining today. Hope you found it helpful. You can always go back and listen also, again, as much as you want, because these are available to you to listen through Flute World's YouTube, which is great. And I hope you join me for next month as well. So have a great month until then, and I look forward to seeing everyone hopefully soon. Take care. Bye-bye.